I am here at the Center for Swedenborgian Studies at the Graduate Theological Union here in Berkeley, California. And I'm here in the beautiful Berkeley Hills, which are part of the ancestral land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people in the territory of Huichin, previously the land of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. Today, this land continues to be important to our neighbors from Muwekma Ohlone tribe, as well as Verona Band descendants. So that is where I am in this beautiful, beautiful sunny land on this beautiful day. This is brought to all of us today by a group called Swedenborgians in Action Against Racism, or SAR for short. We're also here with the support of two co-sponsors, Born Brown, which we will hear a little bit about in just a moment, and the Center for Swedenborgian Studies. Our program tonight will have a few very brief introductions and an opening prayer with Reverend Shada Sullivan. And then I will introduce our speaker, Reverend Dr. Randy Woodley, for handing it over to him for tonight's program. So, Reverend Sullivan.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to begin with our opening prayer. This prayer is actually a meditation written by the Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman. So it's entitled To See and to Do. I seek courage to see the true thing. It is a fearful admission that courage is required to see the true thing. So much of my vision is blurred by my fears, my anxieties, my narrow self-interests, that I find difficulty sometimes in giving full range to a searching scrutiny. It may be that I suspect the effect on me of seeing things in their true light. Waiting in the quiet experience of worship, I seek the courage, the push of God, to see the true thing in everything with which I am involved. I seek courage to do the true thing. To see the true thing is not necessarily to do the true thing. It may be that it takes a heightened form of courage to do the true thing. The act carries with it its own commitment. The act of a person finally involves the person, and they are required at last to back their deed. Therefore, to do the true thing places a searching liability on the integrity of the person who does the deed. We want always to escape the full liability for the deed. The truer the deed, the more the responsibility involves all of a person's life. I seek courage to do the true thing, that my own life may not be double talk. Here in the quietness of worshipful waiting, I seek courage to do the true thing. I seek courage to see and do the true thing. Amen. Thank you again, everyone, for being with us. As Rebecca mentioned, one of the co-sponsors of this event is Swedenborgians in Action Against Racism. I'm here as a representative of that group. And so now I would like to introduce to you all Shalonda Ingram, who will tell us a little bit about the third co-sponsor of this event, and also give you some more program information.
Thank you so much, Reverend Shada. Thanks everybody for being here. It's such an honor to steward conversations of merit in our culture among our relatives. And it's a powerful opportunity for us to remember just how deeply connected we truly are, no matter what we have been indoctrinated with. Part of my work in the world is stewarding positive communications and expressions of creativity and love among marginalized groups. One of the ways I do that is with a brand called Born Brown, All Rights Reserved. And it's really a play on words as well as an opportunity for healing and sharing powerfully. So we'll get deeper into that as we go. I assert that this experience is very much us experiencing social movement and practicing together, doing the true thing. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much, Shalonda. All right. So our speaker this evening, Reverend Dr. Randy Woodley, is known as a public intellectual, author, scriptwriter, activist, farmer, speaker, and wisdom keeper. He is a recognized leader in the fields of Indigenous and intercultural studies, ecology, spirituality, race, theology, and mission. Through his teaching, writings, and leadership, he invites Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples to decolonize and indigenize their worldview and practices so they can learn to walk on this earth in a good way. Randy is a Cherokee descendant recognized by the Keetoowah band. He and his wife Edith, an Eastern Shoshone tribe member, are co-creators and co-sustainers of Eloheh Indigenous Center for Earth and Justice and Eloheh Farm and Seeds. Through an Eloheh experience, they invite people to a deeper spirituality and new relationship with creation while modeling regenerative earth-tending practices and earth justice. Randy has penned numerous books, chapters, and articles in his long writing career, and now he has begun to transition to writing feature film scripts. He is most well known for his connection to the Harmony Way as original Indigenous teachings and how they might apply as common values today in order to build a better world. Reverend Dr. Woodley, on behalf of all of us who have been so looking forward to this event, welcome and thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. I guess everybody can hear me okay? All right, great. Thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to get to know Swedenborgian folk and your history just a bit. This was unknown to me, so I really appreciated being able to dig in and find new information. So that's a privilege for me and honor to be here. Thank you. Hopefully I can give you something today that will ignite some good discussion and maybe some good theology. And I'm really looking forward to the question and answer period so we can have a great discussion today. So this is my propaganda page. So these are some of the books I've written and also contact. So today we've decided on a title together. It was a kind of a fun project, figuring out what the title for this will be, but Dismantling Colonial Dominance in Western Christian Theology, Learning from Our Past, Healing Our Future. Hopefully all of that will be encompassed in here. It's a big task, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I like this quote. If theology is expressed in concepts and structured by philosophy and logic, the primary tools required are a good mind and the ability to think logically. But if theology is presented in story form, the meaning of story cannot be fairly ascertained without becoming, as much as possible, a part of the culture of the storyteller and his or her learners. And so I'm going to ask a question about what we know and how we know what we know, because I think that folks from the West and Indigenous folks come from a different place. We also need to realize that the people who wrote the scriptures were not bound to Greek or Enlightenment thinking. They were pre-Enlightenment and not yet affected by Hellenism or Greek thinking. And so we have to ask ourselves then, how do Enlightenment-bound thinkers understand story? So in terms of how do we know what we know, this is how I observe theology. This is how I observe what's going on in the world. First of all, I call them God's four books. I don't really think of them as books. I think of them more as sort of a circle, but I use the term books because folks in the West are used to that. So creation, which includes my observations, my experience, and my story. Creation has been around much longer than any Holy Scriptures or stories about them. I would call creation the Creator's probably deepest and longest lasting book. Secondly, my community, my experience, my ceremony, my traditions, the stories that I am told as I'm growing up, and then I'm come to realize what's going on. And then our hearts, our conscience, of course. And then finally, the scriptures. Christianity has by and large relied mostly on the scriptures. The West doesn't have too good of theology of creation. Everybody has different community experiences. And so they seem to focus on the scriptures, but I want to talk about what happened in history. So if we look at the major literary styles of the Bible, 90% of scripture is story. So I used to have a chart that said 75%. And both of the Old Testament professors at my seminary where I taught for the last 15 years said, no, that's wrong. We figured out it's about 90% is what the experts are saying. So story then becomes pretty important. In a Western worldview with propositional thinking, it's very linear, A to B, which seems sufficient. So for example, story is used as entertainment maybe, or at the end of like a sermon or something like that, as a sort of a cherry on top or a bonus, if you will. And what generally comes down are propositions. And so we seem to think propositions are efficient. And yet people don't remember propositions. They generally remember stories. And that's because they find themselves in the stories. And so the West, I would claim, misunderstands the purpose of stories. So a couple questions for you to think about as we're starting to get into this. How do you think Western individualism, binary logic, present-future orientation, and I can talk more about that later, to reality affect theology? What could communal thinking worldviews that are more comfortable with tension and mystery and oriented towards a present-past reality offer theological discussion and the scholarly community? So those folks, remember, have been considered not worthy to be considered, I would call theology at the big people's table. So you sort of have to get the degrees behind your name before you sort of get invited to the big people's table. And the result, I would say, because of some of these things, and I'm going to go through them in detail, is that our theology is off because our Western worldview is off. In other words, the problem is not with theology. The problem is with our worldview. So to Indigenous peoples, the problems of a Western worldview are obvious. The way of life demonstrated by Western peoples leads to alienation from the earth, from others, and from all creation. It creates a false bubble called Western civilization, which the West feels will protect them from calamity. This false hope is built on age-old philosophical ideas handed down from Greece, Rome, England, and other Western nation states. And we would want to ask the question from an Indigenous perspective: what can turn the people who call themselves by Christ's name into people who would kill, steal, and destroy people, land, and nature with a genocidal passion? And so I've asked myself that throughout the years, especially as I first began to theologize and began to say, well, what is it? Because I knew Native history well. I've taught Indigenous spirituality and Indigenous histories for probably 20-something years. What would cause a people to do that and then justify it? And so I'm going to share with you where I've come out, and I may be wrong, but this is where I'm at right now. And so if we think about like where the problem begins, when we think about what are the great civilizations in the West, it always goes back to the Greco-Roman idea. And if you don't believe that, then you've never been to Washington, D.C. and taken a look at some of the architecture that was influenced by some of the earliest thinkers in America. So we don't know quite what Socrates said and what Plato said, because Plato was a student of Socrates, and Socrates' writings were all destroyed. So we have what Plato said Socrates said. But somewhere Plato got the idea of what we call, what is now termed Platonic dualism. Platonic dualism. This idea that the ethereal world, maybe the spiritual, the abstract, etc., is privileged over the material world. And so the material world is at best to be questioned and assumed. Plato said basically a thing is not really a thing. It's the idea of a thing that's real. Well, his student was Aristotle. And Aristotle, there's some differences in their understanding of their dualism, but basically it traveled very in various ways. Aristotle sometimes is called the father of modern racism because what he said was that he took that dualism, and once you begin to create hierarchies of reality, instead of all of reality being whole, and you hierarchies where this ethereal world is above the material world, then you can create hierarchies for everything. And so Aristotle had this philosophy and this idea that basically some certain peoples were made to be those who enslaved others and people who were enslaved. And of course, the barbarians to the Greeks were those who were not Greek. Aristotle basically, whenever somebody comes up with that philosophy, they're always included in the select group, right? So Aristotle was a teacher to a guy named Alexander, who became Alexander the Great. And if you see these empires here, you can tell you have Alexander's empire, and you have the Roman Empire, and then you have the British Empire. And this is sort of like Greece sort of hands down this idea of civilization to Rome. And Rome basically turns the civilization, this idea, the same sorts of ideas full of the dualisms, etc., to Great Britain. And Great Britain basically brings it to America. And so it comes and is influenced in America. Basically, the influence starts about the 14th to the 17th centuries during what's called the Renaissance. Well, what is the Renaissance in Western Europe? And actually had farther reaches to that, even into Russia and other places. But the Renaissance was this revival of Greek thinking, this revival of Greek architecture and Greek art and philosophy and literature. And so now all the Greco-Roman philosophers are basically now held up as some of the greatest thinkers in the world. And Greco-Roman civilization is held up as the greatest civilization in the world. And that was influenced by two movements that basically came to America. First, the Enlightenment, which sort of doubled down on that ethereal over the material, to the part where Rene Descartes said, I am a soul and I have a body. So in other words, it's what happens in the mind, the spirit, the soul, etc., that's more real. And the other is, depending on your philosophy, an illusion, to be doubted, to not to be trusted, etc. And so that's how it sort of comes into, and of course, a lot of the founding fathers in America were shaped by these thinkers. And the second way it came was through the Reformation. And the Reformation, Protestant Reformation, basically doubled down as well. But what they did was they doubled down on the products of the mind, so that now doctrine, those things that are logically thought through, those doctrines that are hammered out in logic and thought and considered to be important to the church, that became of utmost importance. And embodiment of that theology, which is the exact same thing that Howard Thurman's his prayer was used for, to say earlier, the doing of it was not considered as important. And so now you can think theologically, and if your actions don't line up, there's always a rationalization or a justification for that. And usually it's some theological premise that would justify that. And then it came, of course, to the Puritans. Puritans understood themselves largely, especially thinkers like Cotton Mather and John Winthrop, William Bradford, who thought of themselves basically as the pure church, the ones who have it right, and they were extremely well educated and extremely theological. They were so convinced that their doctrines were right that they would punish people who violated any part of their doctrines and their theologies, and sometimes they would kill them. So I did some comparison of Western worldview versus the indigenous worldview from America. And these are some of the things, if you want to take a look, kind of look down those lists. And I think I'm comparing apples to apples, but there's a lot of differences. And we're just going to mention a few of them. But just know that we're coming from two very different worldviews, which produce two very different things and two very different ways of understanding the world and God around us. So the first one of those is this dualism that we talk about, and I call this the foundational fallacy. To invest in the ethereal, the spiritual, metaphysical, abstract realm to a higher degree than the physical, our thoughts and our theologies then can become disembodied. Again, a la Howard Thurman's thoughts. It creates a secular sacred space to believe that God is at work, so, for example, in the church more than in the world. So it's no longer this is my Father's world, this is my Father's church, and everything outside that is somewhat suspicious. The physical land, our good works, our bodies then all become suspect. And it creates binary thinking so that things have to be either right or wrong, either legal, illegal, heaven or hell, sin or holiness, success or failure, civilized or primitive, introvert, extrovert, saved or lost, clean or dirty, weeds or plants, animals or varmints. These are all categories that we call binary thinking. It's like there's no ability to hold things that might be in tension, to hold those things without solving and resolving them. It makes it also that every problem can be solved. In other words, that, you know, like we can just figure this out if we just all sit down together. So part of what happens during dualism, dualistic thinking, is reductionism, the extrinsic compartmentalization of body and classifies lives into many parts without attention to the whole. It's not necessarily a bad thing. So, for example, I have a podiatrist and I have a cardiologist, and I'm glad and I have a general practitioner. But if my podiatrist doesn't pay attention to what my cardiologist is doing, or vice versa, I can be in real trouble. And they are working out of a partial reality rather than a whole reality. And so this extrinsic compartmentalization is dangerous when we forget to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And that's done in so many fields, including theology, but it also theologically comes out to where that salvation is for our souls and not for the whole earth, not for everything. Hierarchies, I talked about Aristotle as the father of this thinking, the hierarchical thinking. So everything is ranked greater or lesser. Equality then is wrong or not preferred, even if you call it democratic. The results of historical Western structured systems have created dehumanization by class, by race, by ethnicity, by gender, by religion, by nationality. This wasn't just bad thinking, this was a bad worldview. Anthropocentrism, where humans are above nature. And how this really got started, as I can tell in the church, is really with Ignatius of Antioch. He wanted to make the church acceptable to Roman culture so that they weren't persecuted so much. And so he began to structure hierarchical, trying to contextualize it. And so a field marshal in a Roman military would be like a bishop, and a captain or a centurion would be like a pastor, etc. And so those were functional at first, but by the 3rd century, we see that the especially when the Constantinian Empire comes in, that that Christianity basically was ready to be hierarchical. It was already set. Utopianism, which is a shared myth among most movements, living for another world either in the future or in the past. Like if it's not the future, what the future is supposed to look like, it's, well, what was it like in the past when things were perfect, the idea. And so I find that utopianism negates our human frailty, the fact that we make mistakes, and it seeks perfection, which is not really attainable. And it ends, that's where the ends justify the means, is usually what happens in most utopian movements. Individualism is one of the ones that has really affected our country in the United States. If you were from the United States, probably the most individualistic society that ever occupied the earth. We get the loss of corporate and the loss of community, a loss of cooperation and more competition. The scriptures then are interpreted for me, although that's not exactly how they were written. For people in an individualistic worldview, it was written for we, and me becomes a byproduct of the we. Things like a majority rule over consensus, which to me is just a horrible way of making decisions where 49% of the people lose and 51% win. White supremacy also comes out of this dualistic thinking. The idea that white, light-skinned, Western European descent have the inherent right to control all governance, knowledge, wealth, and power in any given system. It's a symptom of otherism. The Greeks had their barbarians, the Romans had their savages, the English had their heathen. In North America, you can just sort of take your choice. There have been so many others in North America, even to this date today. And creates a intolerance for difference. Laws and other systems are formed to maintain control of those differences so that they're not so great. And a modern expression of white normalcy and white privilege is basically how it comes out. Materialism, things over people, greed, just a little more. So now I want to tell you a story, and I want to compare two stories and how we might see those differently. So among our Cherokee people, the story goes around where the people were at one time being selfish. They were killing animals and taking only the choicest parts. They were just leaving the carcasses there to rot. They didn't say, they weren't grateful for what they were given. And then they would just pick plants and do the same thing. Well, the animals were watching all this, and the animals decided to come together and have a big council. And in that council, they allowed the bears to lead them. And and it's a kind of an inside joke among Cherokee people, because bears are considered our closest relatives. In other words, they're the closest things to humans. So the bears basically take over, and they ask the questions like, well, how are the people killing us? And they're killing us with bow and arrows. And so they decide, well, then we need to kill them with bow and arrows. And so they begin to create bow and arrows, but the bears wanted to be the shooters, and they have these long claws, and so they couldn't get accurate. Arrows were flying everywhere. So the group said, hey, how about inchworm? Let's let inchworm lead us. And so inchworm began to lead. And it's also a sort of a inside that in Cherokee stories, it's usually like the smallest and least likely are usually the ones who basically have the answers and help people. So inchworm began to listen to all the different animal peoples, and finally came up with an idea and said, hey, what if we put diseases on all the people? And so they began to think of diseases. And so they thought of things like smallpox and chickenpox and influenza and different diseases to give the people. And the people began to die. And the way that we tell the story is, because we're a matrilineal society, is that the children began to die and the old people began to die. and the men begin to die, and finally the strong women begin to die. And at that point, they all said, well, what are we going to do? We're not going to be around anymore if we're all dead. And so they continue to be sick. But the plant people, the plants were watching all of this. And so the plants came together in a council and they said, we feel sorry for the humans. Well, during this time, the humans went back to the animals and they said, hey, we're sorry for what we did. If you take these diseases off us, we'll not do that anymore. But the animals said no. But the plant people saw this and they said, well, then we'll help them. And so they decided they would start sending cures to the people in their dreams. And so they would send a cure for one thing or another, and then the people began to get well again. And so finally, all the three councils came together, the animals, the plants, and the people, and they made some decisions and they covenanted together. And they decided that from now on, if a human being picks a plant, or if it takes an animal, that it would do several things. One is that it would put tobacco on the ground. The humans would put tobacco down and say a prayer of thanks to that animal, to the earth, and to Creator. And secondly, that they would use every part of that animal or every part of that plant that they could, so that nothing was wasted. And they would always be grateful from that point on. And so that's the story, what we call the Cherokee story of disease and medicine. And from that, we can begin to understand humanity's role and our purpose on earth, to learn from our mistakes. And there's probably much more. These are just some of the things that I think of. To learn from our mistakes, to allow creation to teach us, to keep the balance in the whole community of creation, and to maintain gratitude and ceremony. Now, the Christians have a story also. In the beginning, there's this beautiful array of things that are done to create harmony and balance in the world. The light in the day and the light at night, and earth and water, and all of those kinds of things. And there's this beautiful story of balance that comes together. And then as you go on, Creator gives human beings this mandate to, quote unquote, rule and subdue all the earth. The context there, and then in 2:15 and following, to work the garden and to care for it. So the whole context there is to be in the image of God and to treat the earth as God would treat it. And so the idea of this radah, that's often translated dominion, is really a bad translation, because it's not in context with the rest of the story, and that word dominion is not used so much. And so we get a whole picture when we read the whole story. And we find out that human beings are created last, basically for the same reasons as the Cherokee story, because they are the only ones capable, made to take care of everything else, or the garden, or what I call the community of creation. And so, since dominion does not always mean by force, to dominate by force, but it's been interpreted that way, I guess, if you're a king and you've got this group translating the scriptures, that idea of dominion and force probably is a pretty common and well understood word. But a better translation is to take responsibility for, as an agent being responsible to those assure the well-being of those in their care. In other words, to co-sustain the whole community of creation, or in our Cherokee way, we would call Eloheh. Eloheh is this word that's much like the Hebrew shalom, big picture shalom, or throughout all Native American tribes, or at least all that I know of, what we call the harmony way, to keep things in harmony and balance. And that's for the whole community of creation. For any time anything gets out of balance, that's our job. That's what human beings are put here for. The West has largely failed in its mandate to till and keep the soil, that is, to serve the community of creation, in part due to a radical misunderstanding of humanity's place within the created order. So I say we're all born to be indigenous. And I like to distinguish between the small I and the capital I. Indigenous with a capital I means those people who have inhabited and are still inhabiting a particular land from the earliest times before colonization. But I think all of us were that indigenous at one time from somewhere. But we all can be indigenous in this first meaning, which is originating or occurring naturally to a particular place. We were born in our origin stories, and from my understanding, either I could take the Genesis, or I could take the Cherokee story in the same way. We were born to be caretakers of the community of creation, to care for the garden, so to speak. And yet we're not raised to be indigenous. There's a blockage. There's a hurdle that we must cross in order. And I want to also just bring in this idea of what is organic to the soil, living organisms. So if you think about like maintaining the whole community of creation, that includes the soil, that includes the earth itself, that includes the water, that includes the trees, that includes the coral reefs, all of these things. And since we already carry 39 trillion microbacterial cells on us anyway, so if you're a 200-pound person, you carry about 4 to 6 pounds of bacteria that you're carrying around, that you're caring for. Most of it's in your gut, but we're taking care of those because we are, in a sense, walking earth. And so, but just look at the soil. 1 cup of healthy soil contains, if you look on the right side of the screen, all of these things, 200 billion bacteria, 100,000 meters of fungi. That's in 1 cup of healthy soil. So my wife and I are farmers, among other things. And we remember that when we're working in the soil, we talk to the earth, we talk to the microbes, we talk to the plants, we talk to the seeds. It's all alive. So functionally, to be a human being, we are already doing the stuff in our own bodies. We need to also take care of the earth outside of our own bodies, to be a co-sustainer of the literal earth, to keep harmony in the world, the whole community of creation. And to keep harmony is not just to take care of the earth, but the whole community of creation. So whether you are taking care of trying to bring earth rights to a river or a creek in your neighborhood, whether you are working on human slavery, whether you're working on water systems in urban situations, whether you're working on racism and anti-racism. If you are working in that, trying to bring harmony, you are doing the job that you were meant to do, taking care of, balancing the community of creation. And that is what it means, I would argue, to be indigenous. So the Karuk are a people who live in Northern California. I've been to their ceremony, the Pikiavish, and it's a really interesting ceremony. Every single year, for untold years, the Karuk have come together, and they have a ceremony and a dance and a feast and songs, and where the ceremony is called Fixing the World. And they come together once a year and remind each other in this ceremony that their job as human beings is to pray for and fix the world, to take care of it. The Karuk are a good example, and a very obvious example of what it means to be indigenous and to take care of the earth. So how did our indigeneity get stolen? Lots of ways. I just list a few of them here. I mentioned the utopianism and Platonic dualism, the myth of progressive civilization, which I'm going to talk about in just a second, various lies of the empire, homogeneity, lack of time spent with creation, refusal to adapt, things that we'll talk about. My favorite Native author, John Mohawk, former professor at SUNY Buffalo in New York. For the most part, contemporary historians have proceeded from the presumption that modern people are different from and superior to those who came before, especially those designated as primitives. These accounts serve to reinforce the sense of difference and to distance moderns from unflattering legacies of the past. So in other words, they're lies told by one civilization to cover up the fact we just have to make everybody else before us primitive. And so just a very brief introduction, the briefest of brief introduction about what was going on in Native America before colonization. We know about all these other great societies and these civilizations, Greece, China, Egypt, etc. But in America, we also had great societies and great things going on. Microagriculture and macroenvironmental management, sustainable, most of the things that we use now and they call permaculture, sustainable architecture, passive solar, etc., water capture systems, mass water transports, humanities, psychology, philosophy, religion, theology, rhetoric, etc., the arts, ethics, sciences, including math, medicine, surgery, like brain surgery, dentistry, leaching poisonous foods to make them healthy and edible, healthy waste disposal systems, urban planning, democratic governments, educational systems, intercontinental economic trade, complex peacemaking strategies, which we really need to take seriously and learn from again. All of these things were going on, and I just have a couple examples here. And if you look at when these things were happening, you can see that they were way before Rome or Greece. Native America was generally much healthier, more tolerant of diversity, more in tune with the environment, utilized thousands of medicines, food, and drugs, and today over 60% of the world's originated in the Americas. Now, I'm not trying to make a case that Native America was perfect. It wasn't perfect. We had lots of things to overcome, and we weren't born people who decided that we needed to take care of nature. We had to figure that out. But by and large, I think I'm comparing apples to apples. So one place, if you've ever been to Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, here was a large establishment with probably 40,000 people, a very egalitarian society, artisans, spiritual leaders, etc. And they all sort of switched roles and became, did the different things, tradespeople at different times, so that everybody experienced everything. Between 900 and 1150, Chaco Canyon was a major center for the ancient Pueblo peoples, with 75 outlying cities built within 30,000 square miles, composing agricultural communities, trading posts, and ceremonial sites in the San Juan Basin, all connected to a central canyon and to one another by 6 major Chacoan roads that extended to at least another 60 roads, well researched and surveyed in generally straight routes, lit up at night with signifiers. And then, as with most Native American sites like this, Chaco also had an astrological observatory. Cahokia near St. Louis. Some of you may have visited Cahokia. And actually, Cahokia was, they say about 40,000 people, but actually all of East St. Louis was like this. They just, it's part of the myth that was covered over that most of East St. Louis, all these architectural sites and things were basically raised to build the city. The Aztecs, who once fed 200,000 people in barren swampy land by creating floating gardens, they farmed extensively. So let's look at Western Europe in the late Middle Ages. And what we find historically is going on is deforestation, and that's most of their hardwood forests were already cut down, building a number of things, castles, cathedrals, forts, and they were smelting iron, in which you needed like oak to do that. And so the reason that I found this out was because I found out in my Native American history that the first things that were exported from America, as they would bring those ships over, to Jamestown and places like that, they would send them back in their hulls full of virgin oak from America. And so a lot of the cathedrals, forts, and castles are built out of American oak over there. War, most about religion. There was never a religious war. There were wars, but there were never religious wars in America until the settlers came. Topsoil was being depleted. Ocean and bays were fished out and polluted. Rivers and streams were undrinkable. Air pollution, disease, large mammals were going extinct, classism, cities overcrowded, a lot of people living in poverty, the corruption and greed were running rampant. All of these things were going on. And so I have noticed that much of the same thing is happening now. And the culprit, in my mind, is the Western worldview. I think it's a failed worldview. I think it creates things that are antithetical to the teachings of Christ. I think it's antithetical to how Native Americans understand how to live. Normally, I'm asked to speak a lot about nature and our relationship with nature, but you wanted me to focus more on a theological presentation. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this, but I could go on for a long time talking about what's going on nowadays. Basically, topsoil's disappearing, forests shrinking, desertification advancing, coral reefs are dying, etc., extinction. And indigenous people have lived here from 28,000 years minimally. It could be up to 100,000 years without permanently endangering the land. I didn't know if you would be interested in this or not, but I've been keeping track since the year 2000 of what's happening with floods and earthquakes and tornadoes and hurricanes. And I started noticing then that before I knew how to really look things up, there was no Google at that time, that there was this trend. And now here's what the trend looks like. Basically, all of these things have increased in both volume and intensity. And I think it's because we misunderstand our place on earth again. We are not made to be primary consumers. The highest producers of energy from the sun are what they call phytoplankton, and they live in the ocean. Phytoplankton create 1/3 of the world's oxygen supply, and they're in trouble also. But the number one consumer of energy is plankton. And then come your herbivores, your primary consumers. Secondary consumers are your carnivores. And then finally, tertiary consumers, which are your large mammals. And then everything goes back to decompose. So basically, human beings as a large mammal are not meant to be primary consumers. And what I would argue is that we have moved from tertiary consumers during the industrial age to be primary consumers, expending energy beyond the Earth's natural cycles and recharge rates, creating imbalance and disharmony. The Earth is being forced to consume the new primary consumer, which is humanity, in order to restore the balance of energy to the way Creator intended for the community of creation to be. Now, you can take that metaphorically. I don't. I take it literally. I believe that the earth is basically, quote unquote, programmed to, if things get out of balance, to take out the ones who are creating the imbalance. One of the other problems we have is that human beings, we like to build things in a sort of a homogeneous, homeostatic way. So, and yet everything in the universe, from subatomic quarks to the multiverse, is this principle of unity and diversity. It's God's way of building. And this is sort of how we build. What we think of as order and stable is actually falling apart. And nature's chaos, what we understand as the flooding, the volcanoes, etc., that chaos is actually stability. because nature's number one rule is to adapt. And that means stability. Adaptation is stability. The great mystery builds in open systems like fractals. They contain both unity and diversity via their nature. Homogeneous closed systems are actually built to die. And that includes our theologies, and that includes our churches, and that includes our structures. Homogeneous race, age, gender, monocultural hybrid, GMO crops, etc., lead to eventual destruction. The nature of a closed system is to collapse in on itself or be consumed by other more adaptive systems. The nature of open systems is to adapt. So let's talk about adaptation. Order is the reality of planning and perseverance in sustainable systems. Order works with entropy, not against it, building open, adaptable systems of unity and diversity. Chaos is attempting to fight entropy through unsustainable, closed, non-adaptive systems like homogeneity. Climate change, zoonosis, which is the transfer of animal diseases to people, many chronic diseases, etc., are a result of the Western worldview's rejection of creation's natural laws given by Creator. Nature adapts to survive. Under the present circumstances, the final adaptation of nature could be human extinction. We have a short time to come back from our own unsustainable chaos and back to Creator's sustainable order. So for millennial, just to make sure you understand what I'm saying, because I know some of you will go, oh, that's pretty far out. For millennia, the whole creation has been producing enough energy to allow humans limited consumption. Humanity, in just a few generations, has accelerated consumption exponentially. Mother Earth is now trying to rebalance the overuse through random acts of nature. She is reclaiming her territory, spitting out the inhabitants, to use a biblical phrase, in order to restore harmony. The top of the food chain is now Mother Earth herself, which sounds like a horror movie. I don't believe that this is a result of just people. We call it the Anthropocene. I like to call it the Europatricene, because it was a particular worldview developed in Western Europe and really back in Greece, but we suffer mostly from the age of industrialization. This mechanistic view of matter, an oppositional relationship to nature, an economic system indebted to geographical expansion, that's called empire. This resulting political order measured success of how much wealth could be generated and the exploitation of peoples and resources. And so that's where your hierarchies fit real well. So basically, it was a European upper class male endeavor to create the worldview that we're now living in. And I noticed that there's a relationship between the land and people. So in a Western worldview, the nature of the relationship with the land has changed over time, but there's a corollary between how European Americans have treated creation and people, especially women, especially the cultural, racial, gendered, immigrant, other, and the poor. So some of these commonalities are to control, to objectify, to expect production from, to exploit, to serve at one's pleasure, a variable rape culture. We're meant to be in relationship with the earth. Native American theology begins with the earth itself and the community of creation. I find the oldest book in scriptures, Job, to be interesting. Here's one of the verses that interests me most. But ask the animals and they will teach you, or the birds of the air and they will tell you, or speak to the earth and it will teach you, or let the fish of the sea inform you. These are all our relatives. And we're to be in direct relationship with all creation. And we are connected to each other. Chief Seattle said, humankind is not woven the web of life. We're but one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. All things are bound together. All things connect. So in a Western Enlightenment worldview, human beings have been categorized apart from nature, generally over nature, creating a false dichotomy between the physical earth and spiritual beings. But in a harmony worldview, human beings are understood as fully physical and the earth is fully spiritual. So this healing of ourselves considers everything, our histories, etc. All of creation is sacred, and there's a problem with worldview when one is considered sacred and not the other. Religious people can, in faith, embody the whole of ourselves to fix the world. So I want to throw this out. This is my own theological premise, but that we are to be about the business of creating the common good, both structurally, actively, and passively. Creator's love is abundant, including peace, mercy, justice, hospitality, righteousness, restitution, and a whole plethora of characteristics and expressions for the common good, and for which the byproduct is also the good for individuals. Harmony Way is not ethereal or utopian in nature, but very real. The Harmony Way can be clearly identified, and it is communal in nature, not being satisfied just to seek the good of the individual, but seeks the common good and its benefits of the whole community in identifiable and tangible ways. Could it be that God is the most vulnerable being who exists? If God is love, and love means being vulnerable, then God must represent the essence of vulnerability. In Creator's vulnerability, we are invited to become fellow human beings with others who are different from us, to exchange and empower dignity in ourselves and others, to join in reciprocal conversation of each other's understanding of the truth, and to live with, for, and among the community of creation, including people, in harmony. The opposite of vulnerability is superficiality. It's indifference and control, including the illegitimate use of power, which was the biggest failure of the colonizer religion. So what is needed? Adaptability in all of our systems, including our theologies, unity and diversity, relationship repair and rebuilding, restitution and reparations, massive education among white people by non-Western thinkers, problematizing the real problems, and for white folks, and especially Americans, to learn what it means to be a junior partner, used to be in large and in charge. So a couple more words about decolonization. To be in any way an apologist for colonization is to be an active proponent for genocide. That's just a plain fact. The church must rightly declare a corrective social location in order to begin healing. Unless Christians are willing to divest themselves of the wrong social location and its associated power, they cannot hope to create an honest theology of the land. As a result of having a postulated theology of the land, an alternative theological narrative has been constructed. This is all about, in the United States anyway, it's all about, God is for us, and, everything America has done is great, American exceptionalism, etc., which comes on the heels of course, the doctrines of discovery and manifest destiny, etc. Same spirit carrying this out. The unjust social location has created a theology of injustice. In other words, it's not just our actions, it's how we think about it. For Americans, Canadians, and others of European descent, embracing such a project will require a unique process of healing. In the process of healing the wounds left by the sins of our fathers on the backs of Indigenous people across the planet, we must simultaneously heal our own wounded spirits. Left unhealed, these wounds condemn us to perpetuate those same sins generation after generation. So as you begin to deconstruct your own life, it's awkward, uncomfortable, painful, vulnerable, etc., all of those things. But all of these things on the right are the things that we have to look forward to: partnership, trust, relief, empowerment, etc. So steps for religions of the West: adaptability, intentionality, inclusive worship, education by Black, Indigenous, people of color, exploring and embracing diversity narratives, racially diverse leadership, sharing power, self-deprecating humor, no longer taking themselves too seriously, embodying empowered congregations as centers of proactive change, no longer dualistic, where people hear a message. This last part is from my wife's people, a Shoshone elder, who said, "Don't begrudge the white man and his presence on the land. Though he doesn't know it yet, he's come here to learn from us."
Thanks so much, Dr. Woodley. Just want to give thanks for the truth telling. And I also want to acknowledge everyone in the space for being in the space and in whatever there is for you that's coming up. And just appreciate that this time has come and that these conversations are evolving and that there are people gathering for these dialogues so profoundly.
Thank you very much for doing this. I have felt pretty alone in my endeavors to recycle, etc. And it's encouraging to, I feel like we're on a course to wreck the world, so to speak. And I have felt that way, and it's real supportive to me to listen to this. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just say a quick word. A lot of times we get discouraged and we think, well, those little things that we do, recycle, reuse, light bulbs and laundry lines and those things don't matter much. But I think that they do matter, and maybe not matter in terms of the big picture of the world, and everybody's not going to do that, right? But they matter in terms of our own integrity and as us as a role model to others, and even a role model to ourselves. That when we're doing something personally, it sort of qualifies us to be able to step into the bigger picture of structures and systems and things like that. So I do think it's important.
Hi, everybody. Dr. Woodley and everyone here, I'm so enthralled, and I'm so happy to see you all, and old friends and new friends. This is just like food for my soul, and I really feel what you're saying. And this land, we do a drum circle every full moon, and I really feel the spirit of the Lenite and I thank them every full moon. I thank our pastor Kent Rogers for his incredible sermons. Whether it's pro LGBTQ or just helping us to come to terms. I remember my teachers that talk about climate change a lot. Dr. Guy McPherson and his partner Pauline, just saying, we're all racist. We were raised that way. And me saying, oh no, not me. But then realizing how deep it goes, and this culture, and having to own that and work through a lot of things, which we are still working through. And your magnificent presentation, and thank you. This is just food for my neurons, food for my soul. So, where do we start? Yeah, this is a good start. Everything you said, I'm eating that. I'm taking that in. So thank you.
Thank you. I won't comment on anything except for the first thing you said when you talked about the drum circle. So we call that drum beat the heart of Mother Earth, and I think it's a physical connection that we actually make. So, yeah.
Shalonda and Dr. Woodley, I was particularly struck by your slide that dealt with relationship with land. It opened up a whole new kind of ideas for me that the Western worldview of the relationship with land, how it has gone over to treating women and racial and gendered immigrant and all others. I just had not kind of thought of it. I spent a good amount of life on women's gender equality. And so this to control, to objectify, to expect production from, to exploit, serve as one's pleasure, a variable rate culture. That's just a whole new concept for me, kind of putting it all together with the land. So I thank you very much. It's very intriguing. And if you have any more kind of information in that area, I would love to, resources, I'd love to delve into them.
Thank you. And it is so important because when you realize that there's a relationship, a corollary, then you have to go back. And that's exactly why I call it not just the Eurocene, but the Europatricene.
Mhm.
What is the first step for making the social direction? How do you decide or receive the guidance on the direction to take?
Yeah. So I mentioned that in one slide that we had to be guided basically through these things by people who are different than us. In other words, if I mentioned it with BIPOC people, we have to see differently than how we've seen. If you are two parents, you have DNA, and those children are going to have that DNA unless you introduce a new parent. So that means not just that means giving importance to what other people have to say. We're not like you, thinking like you, think from a different worldview, and hearing those, listening to those histories, listening to those, which is often painful. And I urge people just to stay at the table, regardless of how painful it gets, but to really listen to these non-white, non-European histories and understand that and what happens is your reality begins to change. And once your reality changes, then you begin to see it in the structures, not just people, but in the structures and systems around you. And I don't know that there's a formula after that, except for to just basically start moving forward. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Dr. Woodley, thank you for that comment. I also wanted to acknowledge you for creating the framework around this. You've done the critical thinking. I realized that this was happening around me, but I didn't have a way to put it in language. So thank you for taking the time and doing the research to structure this in such a way that I'm asserting I'm speaking for some others here too, that we can now see it and know that it's not just something we're imagining of ourselves, but that it's other people are having shared experiences in a world where Eurocentrism seems to be the order of the day. So really, thank you for that. Yeah, I wanted to ask you, have you ever heard of the term Wetiko? I believe it's spelled W-E-T-I-K-O.
W-E-T-I-K, Wetiko. No, it sounds like it's not from my language, so no, I don't. It may be Ojibwe or something like that. I'm not sure.
Possibly. And what Wetiko is, I don't know, maybe someone else here has also heard of it. And from my understanding, and whomever knows a bit more about this than I do, by all means, please speak up. But Wetiko it's almost like a disease that the Native Americans said the Europeans have, which would have them, it's almost like they're feeding on other people. And I'm not talking about like eating babies or anything like that. It's not a conspiracy theory. But it's just something about the way in which it's almost an egoic type of psychic type of thing.
Yeah.
And because I'm asking about that too, because I'm also looking at intersectionality in terms of race. Mm-hmm. I know for a fact by DNA that I'm not all African. I have Northern European ancestry. So I'm wondering if that is something that exists then therefore it must exist in me. And I've been grappling with that too, because it's not only what I've had happen to me as a person of African descent, it's also what I've done to me as a person of European descent, all combined in this one form called Tracy.
Right. Yeah. I think once
Thank you,
we get
Tracy.
past the major sort of hurdles of race and white supremacy, white normalcy, white privilege, then the next task will be to deal with our whole persons as various, very few of us are one thing, right? We are many, many things. And most Americans I talk to, even white Americans, will say, well, I'm a mutt. And then they begin to name all these different places. And we should be proud of who we are, but we also should be aware of how we became who we are. And I have a friend who talks a lot about the cannibalization, if you will. I've not heard that word, but and just even in the word, he talks about colonization is to consume and into the colon, right? And so it's very very much a cannibalistic society in terms of trying to get rid of everything that's not like it, right? So and that has shown itself throughout various times in our histories. You know, we see it happening right now politically, but I still have a lot of hope, and I especially have a lot of hope for I don't know how many Gen Zs or millennials are on this, but for these new generations, because they're not wanting the paradigms that were handed to them. They don't want our racism. They don't want our homophobia. They don't want all the things that have been handed down. And I'm interested to watch. I don't know if I'll live to see it all, but to see where they go with this, because they're activists. They're activist oriented. So it's an exciting time right now to live. So thanks for bringing that up.
First of all, of course, thank you, Dr. Woodley. Where are you on my screen? Well, you're gone. Thanks for raising briefly introducing the concept of how Christendom came into being, which was around Constantine's time, and then just progressed, and the Europeans made a great big deal out of it. A little bit from my perspective, becoming a Swedenborgian, I tend to make a distinction between what I call Judeo-Christianity and Euro-Christianity. And in our tradition as well, it might be of interest to you that Swedenborg affords the Gospels and the Book of Revelation greater status than the writings of Paul. He considers the Gospels and Revelation part of what he calls the Word, the story of our inner journey. Whereas Paul, a first century theologian trying to deal with some issues and coming from a strict Roman background, for us, that's a kind of a detour from the original Christ message. And yet you look around, most of the churches, especially the conservative evangelical churches who are pushing the Eurocentric viewpoint, are thoroughly wed to Paul. And it's just a distinction that we find very important, but you don't find it in many other churches. And I also tend to think that our current final point here, that many people are bemoaning that we're in a post-Christian age. You mentioned before the millennials and some of the nons that are out there. And I'm kind of hopeful that it's actually a post-Christendom age, and that the layers of politics and power that you laid out are starting to wear thin. So I just lift that up for you, because you may not know it, but you came to learn from us as well. And I just wanted to share that as a response.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yep. One more thing to Tracy's question, if I could. I've thought of something right as we stopped talking, and I wanted to go back to it. And Tracy, you talked about intersectionality, and I just, like, this Friday, I'm on a call. I'm presenting to a group that is a very mixed race group. And their job the idea has been, how do we deal with the trauma and intersectional traumas? So they decided, well, first let's spend a couple years listening to stories from people from these various groups, and then talk about how we relate to them and stuff. So there are, that's a model, one, maybe not the best one, but it's one model out there. And so that is a very important construct too, because we always feel like, oh, it's just us out there, right? So, yeah. All right. Sorry.
Great, thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple comments on how to, I have to look at it as my Christianity, having not studied, just figure out what space I can take. And then the other thing is, in connection to the earth is, my connection is to know where the sun comes up and at what time, and where is the moon and where are the stars. And so my relationship is to my soil, my space, and also the fact that when I look at my earth, and just to say in the Native American sense, is that I live near Fort Ancient in Ohio, so a lot of that is documented. And so the fact is that I walk the earth and have a relationship in the fluidity of what's come before, and attempt to look at what is going to come in the future. So to realizing that where I am is just a moment in time. And so the other thing, as far as the race issues, I would just bring a quick note to the fact that I come from a family that came from Spain into Mexico with a lot of wealth. We had 19 haciendas and we came in 1590s. And so then as I find myself in Ohio, I look at the comparison of the United States and the fact that we gave the commoner the vote. And in Mexico and in Saltillo, the structure and the hierarchy was entirely different. So I guess the thing is to go back and know my piece of soil and find my relationship with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think there's lots of ways to connect to our own indigeneity, and looks like you're owning yours, so that's good.
Thank you so much to everybody who showed up in the space. I will pass the mic to my dear colleague, Reverend Shada, as we graciously thank Dr. Woodley for all of the time, energy, and resources that have come to bring this message to us this evening. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much to Dr. Woodley, and thank you to everybody who has been with us today. Also, just again, noting Eloheh.org if you want to find out more about Dr. Woodley's agricultural initiatives, as well as randywoodley.org if you want to connect with any of his books, and Born Brown, www.bornbrown.us for Shalonda Ingram's programs with diversity. Oh, and then one more heads up is that just to mention that the Swedenborgian Church does have an annual convention every year in the summer. We are having plans to do some follow-up conversations around all of this, how it might relate to our specific context. So keep an eye out for a mini course during that convention. And of course, all are welcome to tune into that.
Can I interrupt? But I just wanted to express my thanks and say thank you to you all, your attention, the seriousness that you gave to this, and I felt very respected. And I just thank you for having this conversation, and I hope it goes well. And if I can be of any help in the future, please let me know. Thank you. Thank
you, Dr. Woodley. So I'm going to finish this out with ascending, once again from Howard Thurman. So both the opening prayer and the ascending are from Howard Thurman's book, Meditations of the Heart, if you wanted to look them up again. So this ascending is called Thou Shalt Love. I think we can very easily put in love for creation in either of these sections that it's talking about. So Thou shalt love. Thou shalt love thy God. There must be for me a deep sense of relatedness to God. This relatedness is the way by which there shall be open for me more and more springs of energy and power, which will enable me to thread life's mysteries with life's clue. It is this and this alone that will make it possible for me to stand anything that life can or may do to me. I shall not waste any effort in trying to reduce God to my particular logic. Here in the quietness, I shall give myself in love to God. Thou shalt love thy neighbor. How I must seek ever the maintenance of the kind of relatedness to others that will feed the springs of kindness and sympathy in me. I shall study how I may be tender without being soft, gracious without being ingratiating, kind without being sentimental, and understanding without being judgmental. Here in the quietness, I shall give myself in love to my neighbors. Thou shalt love thyself. I must learn to love myself with detachment. I must have no attitude toward myself that contributes to my own delinquency. I shall study how to love myself so that in my attitude toward myself, I shall be pleasing to God and face with confidence what God requires of me. Here in the quietness, I give myself over to the kind of self-regard that would make me whole and clean in my own sight and in the sight of God. Thou shalt love thy God, thy neighbor, thyself. Amen. And as we head out all into our respective realms, may we all remember how deeply connected we are to each other. Thank you all.